communities do die once via direct violence. It was supposed to be home, does not respect you anymore.
I look at Taif as a roadmap that should have been applied.
Separate identity that transcends the Muslim-Christian divide line in Cyprus.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a kind of civilizational friction between these two groups. We're trying to give a massage to someone with cancer that the Christians did not want. Now let's make your piece of the pie bigger. If we say, look, Lebanon as it is leading us to a place where we have absolutely no control over our destiny and we want out. Can neutrality be reconciled with transnational Muslim identities in this country? That's a major crime that the axis of resistance committed against the Lebanese people.
Hicham Bou Nassif, welcome to MTV Podcast.
Thank you so much.
It's an honor to have you. We know each other. I've had the privilege of doing an episode on my own podcast with you maybe a year and a half ago or so. And we talked primarily about three things: sovereignty, neutrality, and federalism.
True.
And I think it's fair to say that whenever somebody hears your name, there's like a tag to it, which is federalism. Even to the point that now when I have guests on my podcast and there's any slight reference to federalism, I expect either an engagement with you, a phone call, a tweet, or something. So I know that word and your word maybe, and sometimes it's unfairly attached to you. And the reason I say that is because not everyone understands what federalism is. But we agreed beforehand not to discuss exclusively federalism right now. We're going to talk about something that's even harder to address maybe, but in fact it may be the more important angle to this discussion, which is insecurity, demographic decline, and the Christian experience in Lebanon. And this may be the most sensitive episode I've done, both on MTV and my own podcast. But that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing, because I think it's time people openly discuss these issues without fear, whether it's fear of being labeled prejudice or fear simply because of taboo. And I grew up with that taboo. As somebody who's not Christian, I grew up with that taboo. So I want to take this occasion to really celebrate the harder work you're doing and also acknowledge that this is a Lebanese issue that impacts all of us, but there is one community that may be experiencing something unusual, which is a country they call home. They may not entirely feel at home. So that's my way of introducing the subject. But I want to give the mic to you and let you introduce the subject the way you see it. We both have our notepads and pens ready. I'd like this to be both friendly, and when necessary, we can have the back and forth and exchange without confrontation. So there's nothing we can throw at each other except for maybe a pen and some records on the table. So the mic is yours.
Nothing lethal.
Nothing lethal.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be talking to you. Let me begin this topic with a general question, Ronnie. Do communities die? In general. And I think the answer to that is absolutely. They do die. They have died. And communities will die in the future. Let me give you examples. So we talk about this generically, and then we, narrow it down to the Christian experience in Lebanon.
Sure.
Communities sometimes die via genocide, via direct physical violence. All right, Native Americans essentially disappeared, or almost disappeared, via genocide. Jews in Germany disappeared via genocide. Christians in Turkey, whether they be Armenians or Greek or Assyrians, essentially they died via genocide. So communities do die once via direct violence. Then again, sometimes communities can also die via violence, but not necessarily directed at them. They just get caught in the middle, so to speak. Think, if you will, about Lebanese Jews.
Yeah.
Essentially, that's a Lebanese community. People forget a community in Lebanon did disappear already, and that's the Jewish community. Of course, they disappeared during the war, although the war was not directed at the Jews, strictly speaking. I mean, it was mainly a war between Christians and Muslims, between Christian militias and Muslim militias, and of course between Palestinians and Israelis and all that. But it wasn't a war on Jews as Jews, and yet the Lebanese Jews disappeared. So that's another way how a community can die, via violence also, except not necessarily violence directed at it specifically, but if they are too vulnerable to defend themselves, they can find themselves caught in situations which, simply put, they cannot accept, or they cannot survive within these specific circumstances, so they disappear. Another example, Ronnie, would be the Christians of Syria. They did not disappear completely yet, but everything I'm reading suggests they might, or at least that their numbers are dwindling dramatically, although the ongoing Syrian civil war, strictly speaking, was not a war on Christians.
Right.
But the situation became intolerable, so they had to leave. So that's another way why or how a community can die. First, we said direct violence, genocide, or some kind of direct violence. Another, indirect violence. And finally, what I call moral violence. Sometimes it's not necessarily about being killed or getting caught in a war.
Right.
Sometimes you just don't feel at home because what was home or what was supposed to be home does not respect you anymore. Think, for instance, of the disappearance of Jews from the Maghreb.
Tunisia, for example.
Morocco. They at some point you had tens of thousands of Jews living there, and they left to the point of dwindling. There are still some Jews living in Tunisia. I know my favorite Tunisian restaurant, Mami Lili, is run by a Tunisian who's also a Jew, but that's the last a few thousand Tunisian Jews still there. So why did they left? Although there wasn't a war on Jews per se, they just felt that in general the orientation of the country over the last or the region actually over the last few decades simply pushed them out. So So I'm beginning with this. I know this is generic, but because there's one assumption or hypothesis which I find very wrong, which I would like to lay aside, that Christian insecurity or Christian fear is something imagined. You guys are exaggerating, nothing bad is coming at you, or you guys are sectarians and you are or you're paranoid. We're not paranoid. What we worry, the end or the possible end of what we worry about, the end or the possible end of the Christian community in Lebanon did happen somewhere else. It is happening today all over the place in the Middle East and in the Muslim world, and it could happen in Lebanon to a certain extent. It's happening, slowly but surely. It's happening already. We can talk, of course, far more, but I feel I've been speaking for too long, so I'll let you. If you have I can continue, or if you have a question, I'll answer it.
I'll try to steer the ship a bit. That
Sure.
we're both steering together. But I want to say this, and this is my way of discussing these subjects, which are sometimes, like you said, they come from the wrong sense, meaning people accuse this kind of dialogue as being problematic.
Yeah.
I disagree. And I think that's the advantage of a podcast. I think you can't do this on flashy news clips or sort of an interjection where people are always yelling at each other.
Yeah.
I think this is the kind of room that allows this.
Which is why I'm so happy to be here. Please.
The honor is mine, Hicham. Actually, I really mean it. And
Thank you.
I want to say that if anyone has taught me to even recalibrate my own assumptions about certain words, it's yourself and a friend of ours, Nadim Shhadi, who was actually the first guest in this series.
Nadim.
So let me try to pick at what's been discussed already. I fully agree with the notion of Lebanese Jews. And the reason I say this is because I've released several episodes on my own podcast called El Wadi about Lebanese Jews abroad who love this country, who identify with this country, but they're physically not here by choice. They don't want to come home.
Of course.
And I don't blame them. So there's that. I fully agree with the There's one of the mosaic that should be here and they're not here. Even Wadi Abu Jmil seems odd with a very impressive synagogue that's empty. In a neighborhood that's been gutted. Maybe the community is less than 100 at best. That's not what should be Lebanon. I'll also say it's the post-independence experience of Lebanon that brought in Syrian and Iraqi Jews into Lebanon. And I checked the census, 1932, 7,000 or so Lebanese Jews. By the 1950s, over 17,000, not by census, but by estimate, which means there are more Jews in Lebanon than there are Lebanese Jews. But that's quite telling that it's in the 1950s that communities in the region are seeking refuge here, which I think is part of the story too. Also should be noted that by 1967, their numbers are dwindling. And by 1980s or so, it's kidnappings all the time, and the community is nearly extinct today. But I think both sentiments are true, and they happen very quickly, within 3 decades. Add to that, I think we're all insecure in different ways. I don't think we all feel this insecurity the same way always. But I think all of us in various ways are not experiencing what Lebanon should have turned into, which is a post-Civil War independent country that regains what it lost in the 1970s and functions, it's governable, and it's reformed. That did not happen. I think that, it's safe to say, has put Lebanon's Christians in a place of particular political insecurity. And I want to flush this out with you. And we can attach federalism when needed. I look at Taif as a roadmap that should have been applied. And I think a lot of what we are going to discuss should have been taken care of in the 1990s. And I want to pick your brain here. The essence of decentralization, the notion of a separate chamber, which is sectarian, the Senate, the Syrian withdrawal in 1993, not in 2005, and the disarmament of all sub-state militia, Palestinian camps, and particularly Hezbollah. Those things did not happen. It doesn't matter if there's power sharing, it doesn't matter if it's still technically 50-50, it doesn't really matter. If Ba'abda is reserved, forget that. It's that the 3 things that should have happened did not happen, and Taif has not been implemented. It doesn't matter if the Syrians left on their own terms. They didn't leave because of Taif. Do you stand in, let's say, enough agreement there that this discussion is happening because it's 30 years later of Taif's, in a way, completely being shelved, the 3 tenets of Taif not being implemented? Is that the backbone of this, or does it go back to the birth of Lebanon?
I think it's far deeper than that. I think Taif or no Taif, relationships between communities are based on the balance of power, correlations of force, and essentially considering the shift in the balance of power that happened during the war. Whatever was going to happen after the war was not going to be a status quo that the Christians would find acceptable to them. In the sense that Taif suggested and imposed, in fact, that Lebanon will have an Arab identity. All right? What does that mean in practice? I think it means a lot of things in practice, but it also means that the main thing that the Christians in this country want became impossible. And that is a neutral country. Because if you are, as Taif says multiple times, an Arab country, and you are committed to the Arab cause and to special relationships with Syria and what have you, it means, logically speaking, if you are an Arab country and Arabs are fighting Israel, you'll have to be on the side of the Arabs. If Arabs are fighting Iran, then you'll have to be on the sides of the Arabs. If later on, at some point, Arabs are fighting Turkey, then logically you have to be on the side of the Arabs. So essentially, I'm saying this because you're suggesting as if Taif was a good idea, and then, the way it was applied, things became not so good. I would suggest that Taif was a bad idea, and then the way it was applied, it became even worse.
I like diplomatic speak. I love the word suggest. Yes.
I would imply that.
There you go.
So no, I think so, Ronnie. I think it's far deeper than Taif and whatever happened in Taif. And here, let me expand on this a bit.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't see lots of, anywhere in the world, Christians and Muslims living together in big numbers in a specific country and somehow coming up with a formula that would guarantee peace and somehow create a national identity that transcends the Christian versus Muslim divide line. I mean, honestly, Ronnie, I frequently ask myself, are we necessarily smarter than the Cypriots? Are we to succeed where they have failed? And for the life of me, I can't see why we're supposed to be smarter than the Cypriots, because the Cypriots are divided into Christians and Muslims, and we know how did that end up. I mean, they essentially, whatever the chances were of creating a Cypriot nationalism, these chances failed to create some kind of Cypriot identity that transcends the Muslim-Christian divide line in Cyprus. Same thing happened in Yugoslavia. Yeah. Okay. Same thing happened in Sudan. Same thing happened in Indonesia, where Timor-Leste is, of course, the country is mainly Muslim, and Timor-Leste is essentially a Christian, and eventually that led to the secession of Timor-Leste. I keep thinking, because I'm not just a political scientist, I'm a comparativist. I do comparative politics. I keep comparing. Okay, what other societies? What is this? What is our country? I keep asking myself, what is this an instance of? This is the fundamental question of comparative politics. If you want to compare, if you want to try to make any kind of general, theory of anything, you have to think, okay, so what is this an instance of? And then try to compare it with other instances and try to come up with a law, so to speak, or a theory. What is this an instance of? In this case, in our country, this is an instance of a country that is pluralistic from a sectarian perspective, and in which pluralism is essentially Christian-Muslim pluralism, not exclusively, but that's essentially the divide line. Very well. So I ask myself, are there other examples of countries in the world that are based or built around, a dual presence of Christians and Muslims in big numbers? And yes, there are. And then I ask myself, so what happens next? Well, what happens next typically is a failure to create a national identity that transcends the divide line between Christianity and Islam. This is what we've seen in Cyprus. This is what we've seen in Yugoslavia. This is what we've seen in Indonesia. As I said, the struggle between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis. So there is a kind of civilizational friction between these two groups that we have to think about and consider. And if this is the case, if there is a kind of friction, perhaps the term clash is too aggressive, and maybe Samuel Huntington is going too far, or maybe he's not, Ronnie. We have to think about this too. But if there is at the very least a kind of friction between Christianity and Islam whenever you put them together, then what's the solution, or what's next? Whatever the solution is or might be or can be, I don't see it coming via Taif. So there's something very deep here, very problematic, and I feel that Taif, or other than Taif, we're essentially trying to give, as if we're giving, we're trying to give a massage to someone with cancer. The problem is way, way, way too big and too deep, and we're trying to basically beat around the bush around it. And I think it's about time we stop doing that.
There's a lot to cover.
Yeah.
And that's why I requested a little more time for this episode. But I'd like you to cut me off if I'm rambling. I want to get back to these examples as much as I can. Yeah. So you have permission to say, come back.
Okay.
that's a fascinating way of looking at Lebanon's place among other countries that have dealt with communal either harmony or disharmony over time. I never thought of that before. And I think that is a healthy exercise, so that when you look at Cyprus, let's say, comparing Cyprus in the 1960s to Cyprus today, there's a Turkish invasion, there's a partition. The Greek Cypriot experience has been at least, what's the word? I forget. It's always this academic word, normatively.
Normatively?
Thank you. I don't know if that's my PhD years that I never finished are escaping me. That they've come to basically accept that the island is divided, but at least in terms of its constitution and government, there's no recognition of that partition. And the Turkish Cypriot experience, I think, if I could say this, has been one of Turkey rather than Turkish Cypriot. So that the Turkish government has been more or less the safekeeper, or at least the protector of that strip of land in the north.
Let me not interrupt, but just add
that there's Turkish soldiers even until today in northern Cyprus. Yeah.
But it wasn't like a case of occupation. It was essentially local Muslim Turks asking for help from the big brother. So it wasn't like straight down occupation. And this is something we need to take into consideration, especially now. There's a lot of talk about the Iranian occupation of Lebanon. What I see here are local Shia Muslims essentially feeling with a sense of supranational identity, calling for, accepting whatever role Iran is playing.
Or
and
even
in the case,
I think it's today, the Iranian foreign minister said MPs should meet at the Iranian embassy in Beirut to discuss things, which is in itself a violation. But
so it's not a case of straight Turkish invasion of a foreign country. You had a community that looked at the Turks as brethren because they are Turks and because they are Muslims. So this is something to take into consideration. Whereas you had the other part of the population, a Greek Christian, essentially looking at Turkey not just as the other, but as the historical enemy. And this is a problem. So how are you supposed to come up with a solution when your big brother is my eternal enemy and vice versa, and we are struggling with the same problem here? How am I supposed to come up with a solution?
Let me finish. Sorry, because I wanted to get into Cyprus in that the Greek Cypriots did request for Greek intervention too, and it didn't happen. I think almost a coup d'etat happening in Athens in 1974, 74, 75.
74, yeah.
And I trust you for those days.
That's fine.
And I got it right by accident. That's 74. Fine. And the military junta in Athens did not come to rescue Greek Cyprus. So I agree that there's commonalities and there's yearning, but one side gets invaded. And there's no Greek-Turkish war on the island. There's no Greek and Turkish army combat. I share the sentiment also with Yugoslavia, meaning you do have communities living together under Tito. And you have countries that are very mixed, whether it's Bosnia or even back then, parts of Serbia and Croatia, or even until today, Macedonia, I think, is 35% ethnic Albanian. Kosovo is something like 20% or maybe a little less Serb. I agree that that kind of harmony or perceived harmony can easily crash. But I don't think, and this is where we can get into it, and I can include other examples too, I don't think they crash naturally. I don't think these are just communities that are unable to figure it out. I've heard you discuss this usually with federalism. I think finding a healthier way of governing is the noble challenge for all of us. But this implicit assumption that identity is the driving force, I don't see it. And we're roughly the same age. I think you're a little older than me, maybe. And you're ahead of me in life. You're married, you have a child. I'm divorced. Or maybe I'm ahead, actually.
So what? What?
Meaning that we come from the same cloth in that we know what it was like during the Civil War, albeit maybe we experienced different versions of it. I didn't know up until recently you actually studied here first before going to the U.S.
Yeah.
I had assumed you were studying from the beginning in the U.S. You were at USEC, sorry. But we have that back and forth experience of America and here, both in life and in academia. To me, what I always feel deep down is that the flawed roadmap that is Taif should have turned into something that would readjust Lebanon. Because I share the principle in that Lebanon was, relatively speaking, a model for success. Otherwise, we would have no recognition of Lebanon. I don't know the years, but I can safely say right now, the 1950s and 60s, with their flaws, with their bad moments, that's the Lebanon I hold on to. Not my canton, or not my community. I hold on to that Lebanon, and I think that Lebanon was never given its fair chance after the war, not because Lebanese didn't want it. And that's where I can get into maybe the role of what it's like to be in a country facing regional problems that are beyond identity. I don't think the average Shia looks to Iran. I really don't think so.
I disagree. Let me go back to the example you gave, the 1950s and the 1960s. You know, the oft-cited, golden age of Lebanon. First of all, let us agree on one thing. That golden age was for roughly 15 years, over a century of existence. So 85 years of foreign invasion, civil war, hell breaking loose, and just 15 years of so-called golden age. Let's just I agree on the numbers. But more importantly, even these, the 50s and the 60s, we had two big clashes at the time. We had 1958.
Yes.
So even your imagined, golden age of Lebanon, we had 1958 and 1969. Let's talk about this a bit.
69 referring to 70 and onwards, Cairo.
69, I'm referring to the Cairo Agreement.
Yes,
okay, and 1958, I'm referring to the Civil War. In 1958, you had the rise of Nasserism, and you had a local Sunni identity so enamored with Nasserism that essentially it wanted one thing that the Christians did not want. What essentially the Sunnis, wanted, for some at least, the most extremists wanted full union with the UAR, United Arab Republic. And at the time you had the famous slogan, بدنا الوحدة عاجل عاجل معها الأسمر عبد الناصر. So some wanted to get rid of this country that France imposed on us and become part of the United Arab Republic, or at the very least others wanted that our foreign policy becomes completely subdued to whatever Abdel Nasser decides to do. And others did not want that. So already you had a serious clash over political choices, but these political choices broke down along clear identity lines at the time. That's in 1958. Now in 1969, the situation is even worse, because again you had, at this time it was the quarrel about, حرية العمل الفدائي, how much leeway should we give to Palestinians in Lebanon. And again you had one camp, mainly Muslim, essentially arguing that we should give a large leeway to the PLO guerrillas, and if that means we go to war with Israel, then we go to war with Israel, because and then you had another camp,
of course,
and then you had another camp saying, look, the Palestinians, yes, we can maybe be on their side diplomatically, we can, in 1948, 1949, when they were here, when they began coming, the Maronite Patriarch issued a statement essentially ordering Maronite convents to be open to Palestinian refugees, because the Maronite Church felt correctly that, from an ethical perspective, these people should not be sleeping out there. So the Christians and the Maronites were not necessarily anti-Palestinians as Palestinians. But in the 1960s, it was clear that giving the Palestinians حرية العمل الفدائي would lead the country to its doom. And yet, you had one part of the population, and certainly one part of the ruling elite, insisting that should be the case. So even, Ronnie, your imagined golden age, you had fundamental disagreements breaking down along identity lines, with in one case, 1958, leading to civil war, and another case, 1969, preparing civil war only 3 years, or only 6 years afterwards. So that brings me back to the same issue that your ideological side, so to speak.
My ideological side? So you've now used two combative words, imagine and ideological. I don't think I'm imagining anything. Enough. And what is my ideological side?
I think there's and if I'm wrong, forgive me if I'm labeling you incorrectly.
I've been very polite. What is my ideological side? Because there's things I want.
I call them the reformists. So it's not bad.
That's ideological reform?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go down this road then.
So I bet without knowing any much about your politics. You admire Fouad Chehab.
There's three things I want to get into. Fouad Chehab is one of them.
Yeah.
So let me go through them. Let me start with, maybe I can go back in time. So there's no question 1969 is the end of what I would want, which is the short-lived experiment you're referring to. Imagined or not, those 15 years to me are a template, and I don't mind them. With their flaws, I would give a lot to go back to that. Knowing that it's problematic anyway, knowing that there's many things that go wrong, those 15 years, short. It's funny, Doha until today is 15 years. The Doha Agreement in 2008, it can go by so quickly. So yeah, but that's still, that window, from all the research I've done, from all the hours I've spent, from everything I've tried to document on my own podcast, with anyone that lived during that stretch, I would give my life to go back. But I don't know it. So maybe it is imagined, but not to everyone I've spoken to. Cairo is the death knell. Absolutely. Cairo, not Beirut. That decision in Cairo that allowed for a segment of Lebanon to support a militia that's based here clearly turned Lebanon upside down.
And now this a segment of the population that is sympathetic
Can I finish?
to Iran.
Can I finish?
Please,
Sorry.
forgive me.
That segment, which saw an alliance with a regional war in Lebanon and openly accepting Lebanon as the battlefield, I think it's safe to say, and I don't care how people describe Kataib in the 50s as 60s. I don't care if there's some sort of sentiment in the 1930s towards Germany. I don't care about that. Kataib kids are not arming themselves until the 1970s. But that, to me, is the end, where you have competing militia. That's civil war. Militia begets militia. I agree. 1958 and Fouad Chehab and my ideological side. Never heard anyone say this one. What I like about Fouad Chehab is not his deuxième bureau.
Yeah.
It's not what I like. I don't like military men in politics. And I think the context that he entered power in itself is problematic. He's, in a way, ushered in due to a 12-week spiraling degeneration, short-lived civil war that doesn't turn into a civil war. But still, what I like about Fouad Chehab is less that. It's more, and I don't care if it's cliche, that the Lebanese president, whose nickname is michel-el-murr by Lebanese Christians, for being too sympathetic to Muslim Lebanese, is not letting Nasser in. I like that. Because I don't care if half the population loves Nasser, and you're right, I can remember my grandmother or relatives of mine that I remember from the 80s, when I would ask innocent questions as a child, you would think Nasser was a prophet. Not a leader, a prophet. So you're putting him on parallel with religion. I don't care. I don't want him in. And that's what a Lebanese president could do in 1958. That's not the Cairo Agreement. That's Fouad Chehab. In the middle, there's that experiment that I think should not be dismissed too soon, meaning people are celebrating this country. For reasons I think we can agree, the pluralism and the system then was not just attracting communities, forget Jews, all types of communities. Disenfranchised writers, thinkers were flocking here. Actually, the region's best were here. They weren't in other cities. Bankers were here too. The numbers are staggering. It goes from 6 or 7 banks in the 40s and 50s. Suddenly you have 60 or 70 banks in the 60s. So money is coming in too. I like that model. And that model is two things. It's capitalist, so there's no ideological rigidity here. I'm not yearning for a Marxist state or a socialist state. It's an open state. There's, to a degree, communal harmony to a degree. Not fully, not entirely. And I think we could agree on this. There's something that Lebanon didn't have afterwards. Neutrality. That, to me, is the missing ingredient. Not identity, it's neutrality.
No, but may I reply to this?
Sure.
I think you're missing the most important thing about Shehabism. Shehabism, in a nutshell, was an attempt to reconcile Muslims with the idea of Lebanon via two things: giving them more power internally and accepting a certain pro-Arab orientation of Lebanon externally. That was what Fouad Chehab was trying to do. And in exchange for that, he was making the bet that Muslim identity will somehow be reconciled with Lebanon. That was a bet worth making. But when the acid test for that test came a decade later, in 1969, because in 1969, Muslim communities had a choice. If truly they had been reconciled by then with Lebanon, then there was no way, no chance anybody would accept Hurriyat al-Amal al-Fidai. But in fact, everybody on the Muslim, well, not everybody, a majority on the Muslim side supported Hurriyat al-Amal al-Fidai, which basically, I want to remind you, Ronnie, that the Prime Minister at the time, Rashid Karami, boycotted Shar al-Hulu for a month, which basically led the state on its knees to basically sign on its own demise in Cairo. So to go back to your beloved Chehab, your beloved Chehab essentially.
I didn't say you're using words.
I'm just provoking
you.
You
are deliberately. Did I say? I actually tried to put nuance.
Just a bit.
My beloved Chehab, my
to go back. Fine. I'm just okay. I'm just provoking you on purpose. Listen, to go back.
Merry
to
Christmas, Hicham.
To go back to what really matters. Yeah. Actually, it's my birthday, so
is it your birthday today?
Yesterday.
Yeah.
But to go back, what really matters, because I don't think my birthday matters at all. To what really matters is thinking about Chehabism in its historical context, in what he was trying to do. What he was trying to do fundamentally was, okay, you Muslims protested or basically complained about too much power given to the Christians in Lebanon. Now let's make your piece of the pie bigger. On the one hand, on the other hand, Muslims complained that Lebanon is too pro-Western. Okay, let's make Lebanon more balanced in this regard. In exchange, what he wanted, loyalty to Lebanon. Well, loyalty to Lebanon, the test for it came in the 1960s, and it turns out that Shihab's hopes were completely shattered. And let me remind you, Ronnie, that the three most important allies that Fouad Chehab had on the Muslim side were Rashid Karami. He was most frequently prime minister under Chehab. One, Kamal Jumblat, and Mufti Hassan Khalid. These were some of the pillars, perhaps the most important pillars, in essentially the Chehabist experiment in Lebanon. And you have to remember, Ronnie, we have to remember that these exact three people that were supposed to be Chehab allies by the late 60s were going full steam defending the Palestinians. Perhaps you remember what Hassan Khalid, may he rest in peace, the Mufti said, if the Lebanese army is the army of the Christians, then the PLO is the army of the Muslims. Of course, you should also, I'm sure you remember that Kamal Jumblat was the main political ally of the Palestinians until he died, and Rashid Karami too as well. So the main Chehabi apparatus, so to speak, that was supposed to be the partner of Fouad Chehab, of the Christian Fouad Chehab, of the Maronite Fouad Chehab, in putting Lebanon above any other allegiance, that component of the Chehabi apparatus ended up supporting the Palestinian guerrillas in Lebanon, with the major part of the population accepting that. So that was the test for Lebanese nationalism, and it failed. And in my mind, Lebanese nationalism is failing again, because when essentially your role as a country now is to become a bargaining chip in the hands of Iran, in the hands of the mullahs of Iran, as it is the case currently, and when the country is paying a very dear price because of it, then when you go to elections, and when you know that Hezbollah and Harakat Amal are the main culprits behind that, and then you find that 95% of Shia voters, 95% voted for Amal, Hezbollah and their allies, then in my mind, that's again a failure of Lebanese nationalism. It is, Ronnie, it is as if after everything Maréchal Pétain did in France, and then you go to elections and 90% of the population support Marshal Pétain. That would mean that the majority of the French are voting for someone whose allegiance and politics are anti-French at the time.
Let me try.
Essentially, to sum up, these are major critical junctures showing the failure of the Lebanese experiment. If the Lebanese experiment did fail, then you cannot tell me Taif is the answer, or administrative decentralization is the answer, or what have you. The question should be: Can we, as Christians and Muslims, somehow succeed in where everybody else has failed, where the Cypriots failed, where the Yugoslav failed, where the Sudanese failed, where the Indonesians failed, where everybody else? Can we succeed somehow in creating a Lebanese identity that transcends somehow these? I'm not saying, I don't imagine that Muslims would cease feeling Muslims and Christians would cease feeling Muslim. But can we create some kind of Lebanese civil nationalism that would allow for all of us to, while retaining our identities, think and act as Lebanese? So far, Ronnie, the quest for that has been a failure, and I worry because the price of that failure.
You're not giving me time to talk, Hicham.
You're
stealing the mic. I let you steal the mic.
I'll finish here. Okay. To go back to our topic.
Yeah.
Because what I'm talking essentially about is the failure of the Lebanese experiment. And one of the most tragic results of that failure is the Christian community leaving. Because this is our topic.
Okay, so let me go back to that,
Sure.
and then we can. I'll try.
Sure, please.
I'll try. I mean, I don't know if I can, because I think, in a way, you've determined the outcome already. Maybe you're seeing it moving in a certain direction. It's inevitable. I'll try to show you from my side.
Okay.
And happy birthday.
Thank you.
From a Lebanese Muslim. I would say happy birthday as Any country would collapse under the weight of the Cairo Agreement. I don't think we're unique to that kind of problem. Jordan found a way under military rule and kingdomship and all that comes with dictatorial policy to kick out Arafat. And he ended up here for reasons that have been explored endlessly. But I think any country that's inheriting a regional war, whether there's Christians or Muslims or Jews or whatever, I think that's going to put so much pressure on a society, and I think it's remarkable that it took 5.5 years for Lebanon to collapse. That, to me, is impressive. Those Kataib militiamen training in the mountains, it took them 5 years. I think that's quite important. So I would extend the 15-year imagined version of history to include those years too. That Lebanese that grew up in those years, that's our parents' generation, saw the collapse of the country, but they saw something they loved collapsing. I'll also emphasize, I'm not married to Taif. I don't know Taif enough to... I've read Taif as much as I can, but I think if anyone's a constitutional expert, it would be you, not me. But the ethos of Taif, I think, problematic and all that, is trying, under Syrian tutelage, to take us back over time to 1969. I think that year, even though it's 54 years ago...
I disagree with that.
Okay, but we can... Yeah. Let me try. Let me try talking Shway.
Please.
54 years of a post-Civil War occupation that ends the Civil War on Syria's terms. I think I don't mind the word reform. I don't think it's ideological either. I think reform should be allowing those years to actually mature, meaning the 1960s. And you're right, half the population sides with the PLO in the 1970s. And you're right, the other half wants the PLO out for the most part. And I don't care if there's Christians and Muslims on both sides of that either. It's the majority.
Majority.
Yeah. But still, in 1958, the Lebanon that I understand didn't turn into that mess. It was put back together quickly. That's good. That's not bad. I think 1958 is an example of good, not bad. 1958.
5,000 people died in 1958. How could that possibly be good?
Because it didn't turn into 150,000.
So that's the best. So essentially, these are our choices:
No.
either a small civil war or
I'm saying
yes. Go, please.
You
please.
promised.
Yes, go. Go. I'm sorry. I apologize. Please go.
1958.
Yeah.
Where neither of us were alive for.
Yeah.
Yes, several thousand Lebanese paid an ultimate price in 12 weeks or so, and friction led to what felt like the end of Lebanon, and Lebanon didn't die. To me, that's a success story. It doesn't mean that the moment people are shooting each other, you have to give up on Lebanon, or at least my understanding of Lebanon. And maybe this goes back to where we disagree. Maybe. We don't share a common understanding of Lebanon. I think your Lebanon is Lebanese Christian only. I don't think your Lebanon includes me. And I think you're saying it fairly. You're not saying it in a disingenuous way. I think you're saying it in a way that that's the Lebanon you relate to. Meaning, you're seeing your community decline. You're seeing your political allegiance unable to meet its fullest potential because of a country that we're both stuck in under Iranian tutelage right now. But not always Iran. And we grew up under Syrian occupation that I think hurt Lebanese Christians the most politically. And yes, the PLO turned a Lebanese political party into a notorious militia in the civil war, to the point that the kids I speak to today still think of the Lebanese forces as a militia. I have to remind them they're not a militia, but they were. So I don't identify with a community. I don't care.
That's very easy to say.
No, wait. I don't care if I'm 5 or 10 or 15% in tune with the identity of Lebanese Sunnis. I think that complication is what made Lebanon shine. It didn't make Lebanon turn into an ugly version of itself. That's the years. That's communal, that's actually sectarianism on a path towards real reform. I don't think you see it this way, though. I think you see Lebanese Christians as, in a way, more Lebanese. And I don't know if that's fair. Maybe I'm overspeaking here. But I hear that. Let me step back. The insecurity we both started with, I don't think that insecurity is the fault of Lebanese Christians. Actually, let me bring up a quote. It's the first time I bring up my father on MTV. I brought him up on my own podcast. One of his last tweets, which are still online, Hezbollah, it's Hezbollah directly, is giving Lebanon 3 choices.
Civil war.
3. Complete handover for state security and foreign policy. So no sovereignty, civil war, or divorce. I wouldn't blame Lebanese Christians if I live long enough to see a divorced Lebanon. I don't blame them. But I think the noble fight is to prevent divorce. And it's to get Hezbollah out of our lives. Not Hezbollah Lebanese Shia, the paramilitary security infrastructure of Iran. I think that's the goal. Not to make it a simple reduction of Lebanese Christians and Muslims can't find common cause in Lebanon, period.
Okay, so there's so many points I would like to...
I tried answering all of them.
No, fair enough. Let me try to answer point by point.
Sure.
First of all, it's very easy, I would say, for a white American to downplay the history of racism in the country, or to say we shouldn't talk identity politics. It's less easy for an African American to accept that, because historically he was on the losing side of identity politics, and I think it's very unfair to call an African American who's trying to say, look, things cannot continue this way. Things should not continue this way. There's a problem here. It's very unfair to call him racist. And I feel most of the time, now let me talk about my side of the ideological equation, because I'm not neutral either. We are called extremists. We are called, you just said you think of Lebanon as mainly Christian or what have you, because essentially I
don't think you're an extremist.
Essentially what we are saying, look, historically, Christians living under Islam lived as second-class citizens, and we fear we're heading to a place where we will become some kind of new zombies with no control over the major choices of our life. I don't think that would make us, sectarian people. If we say, look, Lebanon as it is leading us to a place where we have absolutely no control over our destiny and we want out. I don't think that would be sectarianism. I think the implicit sectarianism would be when the others are saying, no, you have to stay, even though the major choices that we are taking are not choices you identify with. That would be real sectarianism. That would be majority hegemony, thinly disguised under the guise of, no, we need to stay together, and the Lebanese experiment, and what have you. This is one.
I'll just caveat, though, I don't think of sectarian as a good or bad word. It's not like I'm...
I don't either. I mean, some societies are homogeneous, like Tunisia, and others are not homogeneous.
No, I meant, I don't think sectarianism leads to divorce. It's not that.
Well, it can lead to divorce. It can not lead to divorce if you find a way to manage different identities.
Yeah, so that's where the debate comes into federalism or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this is one. When you have Christians complaining or saying, look, we have a problem as Christians, I feel it's very unfair to use to throw the sectarianism bomb on them, just as it would be completely unfair if a Jew in 1930 Germany is saying, look, things are very bad for the Germans overall, but they are especially bad for the German Jews. Or if an African American in Alabama in the 1940s says, yes, there are whites that are poor and there are blacks that are poor, so things are bad for everyone, but at least poor whites are not being called the N-word, whereas I am, so things are twice as bad for me. So this idea of we are all in this together, most of the time is not true. We are not all in this together, and the fate of the Christians living in the Middle East is especially difficult, and this is something that we have to take into consideration, because they suffer from factors that are different from factors. They suffer from conditions that may be acceptable to others. For instance, yes, there are Muslims in Egypt that are poor, just as there are Copts in Egypt that are poor. But it's a special problem for Copts to live under a constitution that says Islam is the religion of the state. Okay, whereas it's not a problem for most of the Muslim poor. So basically what I'm trying to say here, there's a special condition, there's a special circumstance that makes the life of an ethnic minority or religious minority harder than the rest of the population, even though there are also conditions that could be common to all. This is one. Two, to go back to your description of Taif, you see it as a promise to bring back the lost harmony. I actually see it as a confirmation of the correlation of forces in the country at the time, setting in stone two defeats. First, the defeat of Lebanon vis-à-vis Syria, and by extension vis-à-vis the Arabs, because Lebanon was trying from the beginning to say, yes, we need normal relations with Syria, but we don't want to have special relations, because special relations with Syria, in effect, it's essentially being a satellite of Syria. So we lost that battle. And the second battle that we lost, Christians wanted political equality in deciding the fate of the country with Muslims, and that also was lost because we had to accept, among other things, that special relations with the Arab, special relations with Syria, the Arab identity of Lebanon, and more importantly, later on, we had to accept that the Syrians were not leaving, because even in Taif itself, it says, because people do not read very carefully.
It says, I think, within 3...
No, it says within 2 years.
2 years, sorry.
Then the two governments will talk together to basically redeploy the Syrian army in places that would keep the national security of both countries safe. Meanwhile, of course, you've given Hafiz al-Assad all the leeway to form the Lebanese government. And so it was basically clear from the get-go that the Syrians were not going to leave. And that was basically a defeat for Lebanon, but also a defeat for the Christians who've been fighting so long to kick the Syrians out. And finally, you also had to accept, because Taif itself says that we have to kick the Israelis out by any means necessary. In my mind, that was essentially that meant, well, you know, we have a so-called resistance in the south, which is Hezbollah, and essentially we are legitimizing one way or another the presence of Hezbollah, because hey, suddenly Hezbollah turns out it's not a militia, it's a national resistance against the occupier. And since Taif says we need to get rid of the occupier, essentially you've given Hezbollah a green light to basically keep its weapons. And so essentially what I'm trying to say, the root cause of the current situation goes back to what happened in 1989, 1990. And I see that turning point as a defeat, both for Lebanon and for the Christian community, not in any way as a promise to bring back the lost paradise that we once had.
Any agreement that's signed in a foreign city on Lebanon's behalf turns me off. So I put Taif in that category. And the truth is, two of the pro-Syrian friendly tenets of Taif were not implemented. And you said them right now. Hezbollah is still a militia. The Syrian army left reluctantly. And it's
15 years later, yeah.
15 years later, and I mean, maybe their allies are still around, and they may even reach Ba'abda. But that, I share the sentiment that its failure, or at least the chances it had, did not materialize, and it's not a great document, sure. And it's not even a constitution, it's a roadmap. But I like the idea of decentralization and giving the Qada more authority that was not implemented. I also like the idea of a Senate. And I want to take the conversation here.
May I interrupt yet another time? Guilty as charged.
Okay, but then you have to give me more time to reply, because there's a few things here.
Fine. The fundamental problem of Taif.
Yes, sir.
Ronnie, the fundamental tragedy of Lebanon is that we've been used as a place where you do proxy wars. To make a radical break with that, you need to transform Lebanon into a neutral state. Okay, Arabs had fought Israelis in Lebanon. Arabs have fought Arabs in Lebanon. Iran fought and fights Arabs in Lebanon. We need to get rid of that. We need to stop that. For that to happen, we need to become a neutral country. Every single, with some exaggeration, I'll tell you, every single word in Taif was written in a way to make the idea of neutrality impossible. So there's a fundamental contradiction between Taif and the most basic Lebanese interest. Simply put, because there's a fundamental contradiction between Taif and neutrality. That's one point.
Yes.
The other point is, and that brings us back to our discussion, because I want to hopefully prevent us from going in every major direction, because we need to stay on point. The question is, Ronnie, can neutrality be reconciled with transnational Muslim identities in this country?
That's the question I want to answer.
Would Shia ever accept a neutral Lebanon? Would Sunnis ever accept a neutral Lebanon? My answer to that is absolutely not.
That's the answer I wanted to get, and we can go back to insecurity and primarily the Lebanese Christian experience. I disagree.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, so I think even though it's taken too long, and even though too many proxy wars have been fought here, and even though we've lost generations, I don't think most Lebanese think of Lebanon as a satellite state. I really don't think most Lebanese Sunnis want Saudi hegemony, and I disagree. I think most Lebanese Shia don't want Iran in Lebanon. Their allegiance to Hezbollah and their identity with Hezbollah is there. They're the same people that fought Hezbollah before. They're the same militiamen that once shot at Hezbollah too. Harakat Amal and Hezbollah killed each other in the 1980s. That's true, 3 years. And they're the same leftist Shia that did not support Hezbollah in the 80s. They're the same Lebanese that paid a price for no reason other than they were confronting Hezbollah. They're the same Lebanese in the late 1970s, early 80s that were throwing rice across the border as the Israelis entered. Lebanese are complicated. I think also it's not in the DNA of any Lebanese to be violent. I think Lebanese kill each other when there's a sub-state group or a paramilitary force or an insecurity that's regional being fought at here. That's what drove Lebanese to kill each other. I don't think it's their identity. But I'll go back to one thing. We both experienced the U.S. this is where I wanted to introduce this, the discussion of a Senate. I know you're not a fan of the Senate itself. I know you want federalism on a larger scale. But I think the reason we both think of, the reason America is a federal system is because it has that other chamber. And the states have rights. That to me is essential because, and I'll wrap it up with neutrality, but the Senate in itself brought very loosely knit states closer together from a confederation into a federation. And that's true. Now you have, it's an odd thing, 220 years later, you have a very, very small state that you can walk across, Rhode Island, with equal rights as California, which is astonishing. And I think Americans don't really appreciate this. When I talk to them about governance, I don't think they really respect, they don't know what that means. It means that two different states are not looking for ways out. They're accepting of each other, and it's unequal to a degree that Rhode Island can veto something California wants. That's a success. That's why electoral colleges are not majority rule.
Okay.
I need to finish. I don't mind that Bush wins, and I don't mind that Trump wins, as long as the U.S. Senate and federal system are intact. This country is not falling apart, and that's a good sign. I'll take it now back to neutrality. I fully agree. Lebanon has tried it on its own and it has not succeeded through violence. Neutrality is a key ingredient. It's not something you can look away from. And if we're going to find a better way to live together, forget how you structure it. Neutrality is necessary. People dismiss it as something that's lofty and bygone. No, it's essential. And neutrality, the way I understand it, it means security councils are implemented to the fullest degree. They're not sugar-coated with exceptions. 1701 is done, not in its first stage. 1559 is done. The Ba'abda Declaration that the Lebanese president himself ushered in Ba'abda, Michel-el-Murr, that's respected. To me, that's neutrality. I don't think Lebanese Muslims want it less. I don't think Christians want it more. I think, and I do think, yeah, Hicham, I think we are in this together. We're all Lebanese. We are by default all in this together. If divorce happens, I think it happens because regional wars were continuously fought here, and we paid an ultimate price for that. And case in point, what we both witnessed, the port blast in recent memory, there's no reason why this happened. It's not Christian or Muslim. Lebanon's a battlefield. Neutrality should shield us from any regime's weapons parked here. But that's not a Muslim-Christian story. That's not sectarian.
Of course it is.
You think it is?
Of course. Who brought the nitrate here?
Wait, you think that's a sectarian issue?
Of course, but let me explain. Who brought the nitrate here?
All indications are that the Syrian regime's barrel bombs and ammonium nitrate, that linkage is real.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So if it's their allies, I don't think of them as a sectarian operation.
Let me just explain my idea. You are absolutely correct. All indicators suggest that the nitrate came for the Syrian regime, at the very least with the tacit acceptance of Hezbollah. At the very least. All right? This is what I've read, at least in all foreign newspapers. Okay. That's a major crime that the axis of resistance committed against the Lebanese people. So far, so good? Do you agree?
If everything that has been said is true, this is the biggest modern disaster.
Okay. Yeah. And then the elections come, and you have 95% of the Shia community voting for the very same axis that brought this upon us. And you're telling me, well, sectarianism, what do you think? Why do you think these people are voting for the Shia duo? Out of sectarian solidarity. And that sectarian solidarity is so strong.
95% of Christians vote for the same groups all the time.
No.
That's not because they're...
First of all, that's not true. But that's not the point. The point is, let's go back to what you said about the port.
95% of Sunnis want Saad Hariri to return.
Listen, let's go back to the example of the port. You're saying sectarianism has nothing to do with this. I would suggest that the nitrate, first of all, was brought to kill Sunnis in Syria. So this begins with, let me continue. This begins with an Alawi regime bringing the nitrate in to slaughter the Sunni component in Syria. One, this happens seemingly with the tacit, or maybe more than tacit, acceptance of a component of the Lebanese body politics. And when then all this information becomes clear and we go to elections, the Shia community still overwhelmingly votes for that, for the Shia duo, who's at the very least a major suspect in the biggest tragedy that we lived through. You're telling me identity has nothing to do with this. Let me beg to differ. This is one. Two, let's go back to what you said about neutrality, because this is a major issue too. A year ago, when the Maronite Patriarch made a statement in favor of neutrality, I was expecting Mufti Kabalen, the Shia Mufti, to be the first one against him. In fact, and this is something important to keep in mind, the first one who said, perhaps we don't need neutrality, perhaps we shouldn't talk about neutrality, was the Sunni Mufti. And there's something very deep in that. Although the Sunni Mufti understands very well that if we become neutral, Iran will no longer be our master. But even that is not enough to push the Mufti Darien to accept the idea of neutrality, because it's against something very cultural and very deep and very ideological in the way he perceives the world. And I respect that, and I understand that. I understand that, Ronnie, except what I wanted to be respected as well and understood as well, that from my perspective, neutrality is a must, and I cannot be taken each time against my will to choices that do not represent my identity in the name of some kind of cause that is always more important than my cause, whether it be solidarity with Iran, solidarity with Syria. So you cannot deny, Ronnie, and here we're not quarreling, we're just thinking about, you cannot deny that each time we were taken into a choice that makes neutrality a pipe dream, the main driving force behind it was either Sunni identity or Shia identity, never Druze identity, for instance, or never Maronite identity. I guess what I'm trying to say is there are 100 years after the creation of Lebanon, there are still identities by the nature of things that are local or strictly local. And you have identities that are transnational. Now, Ronnie, I want to make something very clear. When I say an identity is transnational, I'm not dividing the country here into good and bad. When you say an identity is transnational, you're just describing it. You're not insulting it. All right? I'm not insulting anyone when I'm saying some identities are transnationals, other identities are strictly or almost strictly local. From this different of identity stems a different of major political choices. Is Iran an enemy or a friend? Are the Palestinians in the 1970s an enemy or a friend? Is Syria an enemy or a friend? These are major choices that we quarrel about precisely because our identities drive us to accept different political situations. You're saying Muslims are not against neutrality. Fair enough, but in fact, at every single critical juncture in the history of the country, you had Christians pushing for neutrality. You had the Maronite Church pushing for neutrality. It's not the Sunni Mufti. It's not, for instance, the Shia Mufti. It's not when you have a choice to make that could make neutrality a possibility. At every single major turning point, you have a Christian arguing in favor of that, and a Muslim rejecting it. Now, how?
I have to take the ship now. I have to, because otherwise I need to. Sorry, we have roughly 15 more minutes. We'll wrap it up with the insecurity itself. We can untangle it.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm a minority. Yeah. Maybe when I hear the phrase Shia duo used by everyone, it turns me off. But everyone uses it. Even actually, Harakat Amal wa Hezbollah sometimes, they may even refer to themselves as
الثنائي الوطني.
Well, there you go. Yeah, but this way of explaining a community's allegiance by giving them those two choices when it's 95%, as you said, it ignores all the reasons why every other alternative within that community has been perished, including somebody who died not too long ago I don't think of Luqman Slim as less Shia or more Shia than the Sunni. Maybe you do. I don't.
It's not for you to decide. It's not for me to decide.
But I put him in
that
there.
Community has made its choice clear.
No, the community clearly didn't. Luqman was alive until 2021.
Aziz,
the bullets that kill him. I let you talk.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay. Go.
Your Azizi is sweet because it makes me want to let you interrupt. No, Hicham.
I'm trying.
No more interruption.
Go.
He is as Shia to me as Hezbollah. And actually, Hezbollah, the group, I think they're with us until we die. The paramilitary infrastructure is not Lebanese to me. And I'll add to it. The Shia kids that are fighting in Syria the last 12, 13 years, I don't think they go there because they see eye to eye with Bashar al-Assad and the Alawite community. I don't think of a family that's thuggish. Please keep this in this episode, MTV. A family that has destroyed Syria and Lebanon and its kids that are now in control. I don't think of them as Alawite. I think of them as thugs. And thugs can destroy a country. You see it as a community destroying another community. I don't think of it as Alawite barrel bombs falling on Sunnis. That's a very, very, it's too simple. It's too simple. I think it's a family and it's a terrible regime that has destroyed the better part of Syria and has crippled Lebanon to its core. And it actually drove both of us away from this country for different reasons. The reason we're not living in a normal Lebanon, I think, is largely to do with that regime's footprint in this country too. And its decades of consequences thereafter. Sorry for getting a little emotional.
No, please.
Culture, 51% of Lebanon in 1932 was Christian. A slim majority that had inherited the best schools in the region from Protestant missionaries. I think both of us have at least relations to these schools. Saint Joseph, Jesuits, AUB, Protestant missionaries. These are Christian institutions, Western Christian institutions. AUB, my alma mater, is established a year after America's Civil War. That's quite impressive, and it's still here. Yes, the president is Protestant. Fadlu Khouri is a Protestant. AUB is a Protestant missionary school, the Syrian Protestant College, now the American University of Beirut. I fully identify with that whole journey, belonging to a Protestant missionary school that trains the best in the region. I don't think of it as Christian or Muslim. It's Lebanese. And that to me goes back to cosmopolitanism. I agree with you. I agree. Lebanon is diverse, and I think without diversity, we would never have this experiment to begin with. Pluralism brought its pain, but it also brought real prosperity. And pluralism is what took kids in the north into the Chatah party. There's sports clubs in Tripoli that shut down in the 60s, 70s. These are Sunni kids playing in Chatah sports clubs. That's a good sign. That's not a bad sign to me. You have a Chatah party and you have Sunnis meeting. That's good. That's not bad. It's not that these are communities that are naturally unable to sit side by side. Neutrality. I don't care if the Mufti likes it or not, or if the Batrak says it 3 years ago or never says it. I don't care. It's necessary. It transcends us. If we don't get neutrality, I think, yes, divorce is happening. It could be attached to civil war too. It may not be I don't think any divorce is amicable fully.
Czechoslovakia.
That's the one example.
No, I mean, there are other examples.
That's two nations, right?
Czechoslovakia, it was one country, two groups. They decided at that point it's not working. So
two nations that formed alliance under communism and left each other
before
afterwards.
Communism, but that's a different,
I mean, it's Czechoslovakia. It's now Czech, Lebanon, this will be the first time that a full divorce happens. Partition in the Civil War did happen. There was de facto partition. It'll be the first time there's a real country that's small and different in size, different in experience, and different in purpose. That may happen. And actually, I think the longer we don't have things like guarantees, whether it's protection or neutrality, and usually they go hand in hand. If we don't have that, I think Lebanese Christians will not stick around for this nightmare. They will not experience extinction. I think that's true. My whole goal, but I'd rather live the rest of my life with a far more noble mission, Hicham, which is to make sure it doesn't happen. And yes, I agree. Maybe more Muslims want Christians to stick around than Christians want to stick around. But I'd rather fix Lebanon than kill it.
All right. Let me answer quickly because we only have 4 or 5 minutes. Yeah. Okay. There are several points. First, the issue of Luqman Slim keeps being brought, and I think you said one thing, and it's opposite in this conversation because you said I agree that in 1975 most Muslims wanted one thing, most Christians wanted another, although there were minorities on both sides. I think this is the exact same thing that happened here. I mean, Luqman Slim, yes, was a Shia, but he was not a Shia who represented in any way the majority of the Shia community.
Most Shia didn't want the PLO in Lebanon in 1975.
So basically when the Luqman Slim issue, a tragedy, he was a very noble figure, but he was a noble figure that did not represent what the Shia community wanted in this country. The political choices of the Shia community are the exact opposite of the political choices of Luqman Slim. But this is something that is, in my mind, undeniable. And I'm sorry that the issue of Luqman Slim keeps being used essentially as a way to deny facts.
All the leftists are dead, Hicham. All the Lebanese Shia that opposed Hezbollah are dead.
And I don't think that pushed the Shia to basically vote against Hezbollah. So this is something that we have to take into consideration. This is one.
Baby, all the Christians that were killed by the Lebanese forces, they're still voting for the same parties too.
Which basically means that...
It's not their fault, or it's not a good or bad thing.
No, which basically means communities behave in a way that is different from what you imagine or what you want. We have to accept, Ronnie, we have to accept empirical reality as it is, whereas what you're doing, you're
under
replacing...
Under paralysis, yes.
Now you are.
Well, you interrupt me 10 times. Under paralysis, yes. No, under paralysis, yes.
I would suggest, under any condition, we should let empirics guide us, and then make a theory out of empirics rather than make a theory because we like it ideologically and then try to change empirics to fit with the theories. This is one. Two, when it comes to the Alawi regime, yes, I would say absolutely the regime in Syria is Alawi. I've written a study on desertion from the Syrian army. Essentially, how many officers deserted because they did not want to inflict on their population what the Syrian army was inflicting on the population. I don't think it's a coincidence, Ronnie, that I found 0 Alawi officer defecting. I went to Turkey to interview the officers. I interviewed hundreds of officers. All are Sunnis. And so that's not something that is a detail. That's something that you have to take into consideration. The regime is supported to this day by the Alawi community in Syria, by the majority of the Alawi community in Syria. Ugly, if this is ugly, then my friend, reality is ugly.
Damascus is majority Sunni. Damascus never rose up.
Essentially...
Damascus, many Sunni families supported the Bashar Assad regime.
Because of the level of oppression. So
Christian support, Druze support.
I'm talking quickly because we don't have time anymore. Yes. Third, I disagree with you saying pluralism is a fact in the Middle East or a fact in Lebanon. I don't see it. Because in my mind, pluralism becomes a fact when you have equality with pluralism. I think of the societies of the Middle East not as pluralistic societies, but as hierarchical societies. If you are, for most of the history of contemporary Iraq, if you are born a Kurd, you have lesser rights than if you are born an Arab. In the Gulf, if you are born a Shia, you have less rights than if you are born a Sunni. In Iran, if you are born a Sunni, you have less rights than if you are born a Shia. And everywhere, if you are born a Christian or a Jew in the Arab world, you have less rights than if you are born a Muslim. I don't describe that, Ronnie, as pluralism. You're
talking about Ottoman history.
I describe that essentially as hierarchical societies where one community preys on the weaker communities. And now I see that happening more and more in Lebanon. I think what you're doing, Ronnie, is a romanticization of... You're taking something that is very ugly and you are throwing some pink color on it.
That's a very unfair characterization.
I don't see pluralism in the Middle East in a healthy sense. Like I would see pluralism in Canada. I'd see communities that most of the time at war, and I see hierarchical societies where if you are on the losing end, you have to accept, submit, or you have to leave. Now, to wrap up with the topic, Speaking of being on the losing end, I see the Christians currently on the losing end of a status quo that is untenable. Lebanon has become an anti-Israeli militant country. That's not something that they ever wanted. Lebanon, at least the most powerful, the decision maker in Lebanon is anti-West. That's not something that the Christians ever wanted. The banking sector, in which Christians played historically a major role, has completely collapsed. Essentially, the Lebanese Christians are a big middle class, and there's no future for the middle class in this country, so they are leaving in droves. We have come to a point where imagining a Lebanon without Christians in the next 20 years or 30 years or 40 years is no longer, an imagination of a paranoid Christian. It's happening, Ronnie. The question is, how can we stop this? In my mind, we stop it if we give the Lebanese Christians a geographical area which they can rule according to their choices and to their identity. That geographical area will not be at war with Israel, will not be at war with the West, will be neutral vis-a-vis all the major causes in the region, and will focus strictly on economic and social development. For that to happen, there's a major radical change that needs to happen in the status quo, and this is what I'm fighting for.
I never thought I'd bring up two characters on the podcast, but since you eloquently referred to America and the African-American experience, I am not a Lebanese Christian, and I'm not a Black American either. So I can only imagine what it's like to be an African-American in history. I think I have more intimate understanding of what it feels like to see a community on the decline because I see it, and I experience it, and I know it's real. So I'm not a Lebanese Christian, but maybe my attachment to this country allows me a little more breathing space to say this. If I had to choose between Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, I'll choose Martin Luther King, not Malcolm X. You're not Malcolm X. I'm not Martin Luther King. But the idea of we can't and we have to go our separate ways turns me off to my core. The other thing is, I'm not throwing pink on a romantic story, or I don't want to misquote you here.
Yeah. Throwing a pink color on what is an ugly situation.
No, I'm actually doing the noble fight. And that's what I do for a living. And I will not tolerate any other way other than trying to save not a romanticized story, a Lebanon that was real. If I die doing so, I die doing so. But I'd rather that we're all in this together than going our separate ways. But I'll end by saying it. If that happens in my lifetime, forget federalism. If divorce is a real finale, I will not blame any community for that. We were handed an unfair attempt at rebuilding Lebanon, and we wasted too many years. And I think the ugliest version of history may be the real one at the moment, but I'd rather keep trying than accept it. So, with that long ending and beautiful episode, riveting, thank you, Hicham, for joining MTV and for allowing this much-needed discussion to take place.
It's always a pleasure talking to you, Ronnie. Please invite me again, although we disagree.
Happy birthday.
Thank you, my friend.
My ideologically extreme friend.
I would say my empirically extreme friend.
Empirically extreme.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a reformer and I believe in it. So if that's ideology, so be it. Hicham, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.